Greetings and welcome to Practicing Reconciliation, how to develop an essential discipline for U.S. civic life today. I'm Jim McCartan of Fordham University's theology faculty. I'm the chair of the National Seminar on Jesuit Higher Education, which publishes the magazine Conversations on Jesuit Higher Education, the sponsor of today's webinar. In a moment, I'll introduce our moderator, after which we'll hear from 4 panelists. But now I want to invite audience members to share your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. You can submit questions at any time, and later in the program, panelists will have a chance to respond. Now it's my pleasure to introduce to you our moderator, Dr. Jennifer Abe. Dr. Abe is Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and is a professor of psychology at Loyola Marymount University. She's a second-generation Japanese American whose research has focused on mental health service delivery and utilization among ethnically diverse populations, particularly among Asian Americans. Dr. Abe teaches about liberation psychologies and facilitates intergroup dialogues, highlighting solidarity and accompaniment as part of a practice of cultural humility oriented toward social justice. With gratitude to you, Dr. Abe, I hand things over. And I thank all of you for being here today.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, and thank you for joining us. So consider that for the last 45 years, since General Congregation 32 met in 1974 and 5, the mission of the Society of Jesus has been framed as the service of faith, of which the promotion of justice is an absolute requirement. This has been the hallmark of Jesuit higher education for these years. So listen to the vision of the gospel articulated at that meeting, which I think really continues to resonate for us. And I quote, "The gospel demands a life freed from egoism and self-seeking, from all attempts to seek one's own advantage, and from every form of exploitation of one's neighbor. It demands a life in which the justice of the gospel shines out in a willingness not only to recognize and respect the rights of all, especially the poor and the powerless, but also to work actively to secure those rights. It demands an openness and generosity to anyone in need, even a stranger or an enemy. It demands toward those who have injured us, pardon. Toward those with whom we are at odds, a spirit of reconciliation," end quote. That was 1975. What would it mean for us and for Jesuit higher ed if over the next 45 years we took seriously this call to embrace the work of reconciliation, as General Congregation 36 challenges us to do? Specifically, how might we consider the question of how God invites us to share in this work, the work that is threefold: reconciliation with God, with one another, and with creation? The Jesuits remind us again that reconciliation reflects not just healing, but it's always a work of justice. And here I quote again from GC 36, "A justice discerned and enacted in local communities and contexts." Today, we ask how we as Jesuit institutions of higher ed and individuals within them might engage in the practice of reconciliation. I would like to briefly introduce our 4 panelists who will share with us. We'll first have Father Pat Conroy, a Jesuit. Pat has served as a campus minister, Pat is serving as a campus minister at Gonzaga University after many years at our capital. Between 2011 until January of this year, 2021, he served as chaplain of the U.S. House of Representatives, offering pastoral care for members of Congress, their staffs, and their families. Next, we'll have Dr. Kathy Keaveney, the Darrell and Juliet Libby Professor of Boston College. She'll offer her perspective. She's a scholar of the law and of theological ethics, author of scores of academic articles and of 4 books, including Prophecy Without Contempt, Religious Discourse in the Public Square. Then we'll welcome Dr. Cynthia Gannett, who has spent several years directing writing programs at Fairfield and at Loyola University of Maryland. She's the founding president of the International Society for the Study of Jesuit Rhetoric and co-editor of Traditions of Eloquence, the Jesuits and Modern Rhetorical Studies. Finally, we will welcome Congressman Joseph Gao, who is an alumnus of Fordham University and Loyola University, New Orleans, and who now practices law in New Orleans. He came to the US in 1975 as a refugee and in 2009 became the first Vietnamese American to serve in the House of Representatives. He gained notice or notoriety when he became the sole member of his caucus to support the Affordable Care Act. Please join me in welcoming our panelists today. Pat, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer, for your introduction, and welcome to everybody who is tuning in. It's nice to be seen on the screen by somebody other than the geeks that watch C-SPAN. I feel a little bit out of place in this group, as my experience of Jesuit higher education has always been from pure position of a campus minister, and I'm just now returned to that after 20 years away from it. I've worked at Georgetown and Seattle U before working now at Gonzaga. So that's my familiarity with the conversations and the purposes of or the goals of higher education. But I am a Jesuit. I engage in rhetoric, and I'll say something. One of the things that I was asked to address just minimally was the question or place of discernment in and around the events of January 6th. And would just like to point out that there was a serious absence of any kind of discernment on that day by anybody. And it's really difficult beyond personal, engaging in discernment in one's own personal life and one's own personal decisions, and engaging in a group discernment process. We saw a mob on January 6th, both inside and outside the Capitol, in the sense that there were individuals who were doing things because of the group, because of the mob, or that they would never personally have done if it were just them. And a lot of those who did engage in, let's say, personal discernment, they were committed to going to the Capitol to demand something, prescinding from the realities of what they were demanding, and had no intention of being involved in anything like what happened. Once they got there, that was out the window. Of course, we don't hear from those who actually, oh my God, and walked away. But there were a lot of people whose reason for going there was changed by the mob and engaged in behaviors that mobs engage in. The panic inside the Capitol among the members and the police and everybody else was similarly at that point devoid of discernment. So to talk about discernment in connection with January 6th is perhaps what we're talking about is now after that in analyzing it and going back. And I think it's really important because I don't think America, the American public, is in on these kinds of categories, but somebody needs to remind any American citizen that your personal morality is never going to trump a mob. So the discernment will always be, do I want to give myself over to the energy of either a directed or a non-directed group of people ever? And I would say on January 6th, they were quite directed from the statements made at the Capitol and the defense, or at the White House, and the defense that, well, everybody had their, everybody could make their own decision about whether or not to join is extremely naive, extremely naive. So that discernment, in a group context has to be done within a community that really knows what the boundaries of their community involvement is. And the pro-Trump group, the anti-Pence or anti-whatever it was, they weren't a group that was formed by common principles. It was formed by a common negative energy, and we saw the results.
Thank you so much, Father Conroy, for your comments. I'd like to next ask Dr. Kevanee to talk to us about the rhetoric of prophetic indictment.
Okay, I'm delighted to, and I'm just delighted to be here, and thank you for participating in the panel, my fellow panelists and moderator, and the audience for spending a dark November afternoon with us. My remarks are going to be situated, I think, a little bit between Father Pat's remarks and the remarks that follow, because part of what I'm going to say is we need to discern not only about what we do, but also about how we talk to one another. And I'm going to focus on prophetic indictment, which is a kind of way of talking to one another that's part of the broader consideration of rhetoric. So I'm right in between the two speakers who precede and follow me. We Americans love our prophetic indictments. Coming from the Puritans, they are a form of speech that's both political and religious at once. And when I say indictment, I'm invoking a legal term, almost a prosecutorial term. What do we do when we prophetically indict someone? Well, we're charging them. We're charging our interlocutors, or the people we're targeting, in a sense, with a violation of the law, the fundamental law, be it religious or civil. Not all prophetic language is indictment, but the prophets, the Hebrew prophets, do have passages that include a fiery condemnation of wrongdoing. You could almost call it the original call out culture. But it's better to think of it as a call back culture. The overarching goal of a prophet is to call the community back to its fundamental moral commitments and to renew its dedication to the bedrock principles upon which the society is based. Even people like Martin Luther King, who were calling for reform, in their prophetic rhetoric, were actually calling the community back to the principle, for example, in his case, of the Declaration of Independence, that all people were created equal. So prophetic discourse, in my view, is useful in limited doses, but it can be dangerous both to the prophet and to the conversation as a whole. And it can be dangerous in a way that impedes the possibility of reconciliation. How's that? I'll just give you a few, 4 little points about how that can be the case. So first, by their very form and content, prophetic indictments constrain the possibilities for acceptable response on the part of the listeners. From the perspective of the prophetic indicter, the only acceptable response is obedience and repentance on the part of the on the part of the audience. Think of any controversial social issue, from abortion to same-sex marriage and people on both sides. If somebody is calling you out as a member of the culture of death, for example, they're not wanting you to say, well, let me think about it. Could we think about it another way? Aren't there hard cases? They want you to reform and go along their program. So that's related to the point that prophetic indictments often forestall the possibility of dialogue or compromise. Prophets, even ones who aren't actually prophets, but are just adopting that rhetorical form, believe that they are uttering the fundamental moral truth and that they cannot be quibbled with or debated about that point. A third and related point is that prophetic indictments leave scant room for casuistical policy operations and distinctions that we find both in the legal realm and in ordinary analysis of moral problems. Consider, for example, the prohibition against idolatry in the scripture. St. Paul talks about it, Hosea talks about it, Isaiah talks about it. No room for idolatry. How do you think it would be responded to by someone with a prophetic mindset if you said, well, does it count as idolatry to eat meat sacrificed to idols if the eater doesn't actually believe in other gods? I mean, this is a question probing the precise boundaries of the definition of idolatry. It was a live question, as it turned out, for St. Paul, but it isn't really one that you see too much of in prophets like Hosea and Isaiah. And fourth, and most importantly, I think, the use of prophetic indictment generally marks the end of civil discussion. The prophets, filled with righteous anger, calls, as I said, for repentance. One or two members of the audience might comply, but the rest are incredulous and skeptical. They believe themselves to have been, subject to, a rebuke that they don't deserve, and they respond accordingly. Either they counter prophesy, or most people walk away slowly. I think just back away. I'm not going to get involved in this debate. So I don't think reconciliation and the use of this language is really likely, in part because of the structure of prophetic indictment, but also because of a more fundamental thing. When people throw prophetic indictments against one another, they take a higher position, right? They say, well, I'm the person that knows the moral law. You need to learn from me. I'm going to tell you what the problem is. You sit there and listen to me. And if there isn't an opening for a conversation, and the only response is, well, I'm indicting you and you better go get a lawyer, I don't see how you can have the kind of sharing of views and mutual trust that is going to allow for reconciliation. Is there a way forward with prophetic indictment at all? I think there is a small way forward, but you have to be very disciplined. I think the model of Dr. King is very good. He did not take the stance of what the biblical scholars call the oracles against the nation, condemning to destruction the enemies of Israel and Judah, but he took the stance of the prophets to Israel itself, critiquing their wrongdoing, but standing with them when they're suffering. And he also offered hope. He wasn't simply offering destruction. He was offering possibility of a renewed community with the people who he was chastising. And that is the best of the prophetic tradition. I don't see a whole lot of it if you watch cable news and read Twitter, because it's a lot more satisfying for people to condemn. We need to move beyond the condemnation if we're going to find reconciliation.
Thank you so much. It's a perfect segue to Dr. Gannett, who can tell us about the tradition of eloquentia perfecta and its potential as a practice of reconciliation. Dr. Gannett?
Thank you. And thank you all for creating this occasion to come together to share our thoughts collectively on some of these pressing challenges of our moment. And special thanks to James McCartan and Jennifer Abe for hosting this exchange. And I look forward to the comments that have come, and I've already learned from the comments that have arrived. What I'd like to do is to offer one integrative anchor for some of these insights, a way of proceeding, however imperfect, for recommitting ourselves to the project of reconciliation with ourselves, with each other, and with the larger communities that we live in. I'd like to introduce the notion of eloquentia perfecta as a distinctive part of the Jesuit educational heritage, as an affordance, as a means of addressing the complex gaps, fissures, and alas, deliberate tears in public and civic discourse. And then I'll try to offer just a few examples of some interesting and innovative efforts at Jesuit institutions to try to foster eloquentia perfecta in the service of reconciliation and justice. First, what is eloquentia perfecta and why has it been so important to Jesuit education? From the beginning of the order in 1540, the Jesuits identified their work as ministries of the word across all domains of discursive activity, from the most private to the most public. And the educational traditions of the Society of Jesus, for which they are chiefly known, have always been rooted in the rhetorical and discursive arts. With its roots in Renaissance Christian humanism, Jesuit training was saturated with rhetoric, providing mastery of both theory and practice. And the Jesuits have always been identified as being and creating powerful rhetors across sacred and secular domains. Loyola himself was educated at the University of Paris, one of the centers of Renaissance rhetorical education. And indeed, the early Jesuits saw all of the symbolic and visual arts as rhetorical. Art, architecture, dance, theater, and most of all, writing and oratory. The first Catholic order to commit to teaching religious and lay students, even Protestants, as a formal ministry, the Jesuits created a new kind of educational program, the Collège, a course of study of humane letters emphasizing the Greek and Latin classics. The Jesuit Collège focused on active and developmental learning, including multiple years of classical language and grammatical study, followed by humanities, including poetry and history, and culminating in the capstone course of rhetoric, which was a 2-year course of study. This curriculum was considered full training for almost all learned occupations, as well as preparation for full citizenship. Its central aim was, of course, eloquentia perfecta. By 1773, the year of the suppression, the Jesuits were operating more than 800 university seminaries and mostly these secondary schools or college across the globe. In some, according to John O'Malley, for the Jesuits, rhetorical education in the humanistic tradition was not simply a discipline, not simply the culminating discipline, but the discipline that imbued the whole system with its finality and gave it a life-shaping force. There's no time to rehearse all the changes in both the Society and Jesus and the larger cultural changes that reshaped Jesuit education across the last 250 years. Suffice it to say that the renewed society since the 60s has really devoted its mission more and more to social justice and has worked to reimagine Jesuit education for the current era while recuperating many of the vital educational principles of the past. And key to that restoration and the renewal of Jesuit eloquentia perfecta in America has been the development of the AJCU's Jesuit Consortium on Rhetoric and Composition over the last 20 years. Together, we've been working to recover the history of eloquentia perfecta and to reanimate the principles and practices of this rich transdisciplinary aim for Jesuit education in the 21st century. One working definition then, eloquentia perfecta is the aim of Jesuit rhetorical education. That is fostering the development of informed, ethical, civil, sympathetic, and articulate writers and speakers who are willing and committed to engage with their larger communities through the effective uses of speech and symbolic action. Don't we wish all of our people were educated in that way? It would be marvelous. Now, as we look back to the challenges that are facing us right now, we could say that the glass is half full or half empty. Many of us might even say the glass is more than half empty. But as one anonymous wag put it, that's the wrong linguistic frame. It's important to remember that the glass is refillable. So I want to talk about a couple of examples of ways in which current institutions are sort of taking on this task. of thinking about justice and reconciliation through the filter of eloquentia perfecta. For example, several institutions are calling on the elements and aims of eloquentia perfecta as animating principles for service learning, community-based learning, and their social justice centers across the curriculum, across the university, and around the larger communities. Another one, at Xavier University, Dr. Renea Frey has created a course called Writing as Social Action. It's probably not the only one, using eloquentia perfecta as its foundation. The year-long course invites students to research social justice projects of their own choosing, engage in public conversations with many kinds of audiences and multiple modalities, and proposes specific actions and interventions for the greater good. The course also integrates a variety of contemplative and mindful exercises to help students engage in deep listening and empathy in order to bring together reconciliation and social justice. At the University of San Francisco, Dr. Kathy Gabor has created a class called Rhetoric 295, Writing in Electronic Environments, in which students create and extend the Wikipedia entry for eloquentia perfecta as a way of having a positive engagement with digital media and creating public knowledge in a way that offers students both agency and discursive responsibility. At Rockhurst, Dr. John Kerrigan is going to bring Padraig Otuama, the leader of the Corrymeela community that's devoted to reconciliation work across the divided communities of Ireland since the 1970s. He's coming as a visiting scholar and speaker across the month of March. And the plan will be to engage the Rockhurst community in an extended conversation around matters of justice and the transformative discursive work of reconciliation that are at the heart of this panel. At Holy Cross, the well-known first-year Montserrat program has taken up one of the signature features of eloquentia perfecta, the extended development of critical debate skills that foster informed, ethical, and responsible, but powerful advocacy in all of its students. And one last one. At Santa Clara, Dr. Simone Billings undertook a Fulbright scholarship to understand the complex forms of forced migration to and from the island nation of Malta. She analyzed how the Jesuit priests used eloquentia perfecta to preach on the difficult realities of vulnerable refugees and taxed island resources. She's now using this case study to engage her own institution on the discourses surrounding refugees in California. So none of these projects by themselves, and we can talk about several others, they will not fill the deep well of brokenness that we face. But if we all fill the glasses at hand often enough, we may begin to end the drought of goodwill that we have been facing here with.
Thank you, Dr. Gannett. Thank you also for the array of examples across the country. And we are going to return to a bigger picture, maybe back at the Capitol with Congressman Gao. Would you offer your observations about the signs of the time that we're facing as we look at polarization and reconciliation today? Would you unmute, please?
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, great. First of all, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to be part of this panel. I believe that we are engaged in a very important conversation to try to recognize what are some of the forces that tend to polarize our society and what are some of the forces that try to reconcile our society. And of course, when we are talking about the signs of the times in connection with the polarization of society, I would like to point to two very recent instances of polarization, one at the political level and the other one at the racial level. At the political level, the signs of the times that I saw was the one that Father Conroy just alluded to, and that is the invasion of the Capitol by the Trump supporters, and of course, the action behind the invasion was, of course, to convey a certain political point of view. And as I see it from my experience on the Hill, we have become a more politically polarized community. And I can point to 3 causes that would lead to this polarization. The first cause is probably due to a 24-hour partisan cable news. If you watch MSNBC, you would see a much more liberal conversation when you're talking about politics. And when you turn on a channel such as Fox, then you hear a much more conservative point of view. But then again, as you know, the media plays a very powerful role in forming people's mindsets. And I believe that the polarization that we have seen today can be partly attributed to 24-hour partisan cable news. The second possible cause that I see is that people have become either more liberal or more conservative. According to a Pew Research, today 92% of Republicans are to the right of the median Democrats, and 94% of Democrats are to the left of the median Republican. So as we can see, our community, our society in general has become more and more polarized along ideological lines, whether one is a Democrat or one is a Republican. And because of that, it causes or it creates a more difficult situation for members of Congress to walk the middle line. Because why? Because they have to represent their constituents. And if their constituents are to become more liberal or to become more conservative, then that is the rhetoric that they are conveying. That is the message that they are conveying. And we see more and more of that on Capitol Hill. And the third reason, which I myself experienced personally, is the gerrymandering of the congressional districts. As you look at some of the congressional maps, many of the districts are drawn more and more to comprise more and more conservative members, and other districts are drawn to comprise more and more of the liberal constituents. And again, it goes back to members representing their own constituents. What are the messages that they are trying to convey? If one is representing a much more conservative district, then obviously the conversation that must be put forward by the member would be a conservative rhetoric. And on the other hand, if the member is representing a much liberal district, then that district must hear a very liberal message from the member. And of course, some of these problems that arises out of the gerrymandering comes from our own laws. As you know, the Civil Rights Act, especially in the South, requires that certain districts be drawn for minority members. As you know, I am an Asian Republican, represented the 2nd Congressional District of Louisiana. And the 2nd Congressional District of Louisiana was specifically drawn for an African American, as required by law. And after Hurricane Katrina, where many of the African American community went to Houston, the district was redrawn to encompass part of New Orleans, and then it goes all the way up to Baton Rouge, and then all the way down back to New Orleans in order to get that threshold percentage of minority in the district as required by law. And what that creates is that it bundles many of the liberal constituents into the second congressional districts while leaving all the other 5 congressional districts in Louisiana a little bit more conservative. So you can see that these are some of the forces that we see in society in creating, at least what I see in society, in creating a more polarized community at the political level. Now, at the social level, at least the recent signs of the times that I see as creating a more polarized community is the Black Lives Matter movement, and that arises out of a racial polarization from the violence against the African American community. And as I can see here, living in the South, what that does is that it creates a greater tension between the white community versus the African American community here in Louisiana, especially in the New Orleans area. I have many friends who are conservatives, extreme conservatives, as well as some friends who are very liberal. And what I hear from my conservative friends is, well, yes, Black life matters, but all life matters. And we are forced to be focused on the African American community from one reason or another. And of course, I try to explain to my conservative friends that, yes, we have to pay attention to them because they have been victims of violence and they have been victims of racism. And of course, this translates to the African American community being neglected by our institutions, being neglected by our community to some extent, and that has to be somehow addressed. But of course, many of these people, they don't understand that. The only thing that they can understand, or at least they want to understand, is that somehow the focus is on the African American community and not anybody else, and therefore it creates a certain tension that I see within the different communities down here in the New Orleans area. Now, in regards to signs of reconciliation, at least at the political level, I don't see many, at least I don't see at all, due to the fact that we have become a more polarized political community. And because we've become more polarized, it is difficult for political members to reconcile. And of course, when we live in a society that focus on sensationalism, it is hard to walk the middle line because middle line is always boring. The middle line politician is a boring politician and people don't listen to them.
So let's think of this middle line, because that gets to actually one of the questions that we want to tackle. And thank you for that presentation, sure, Congressman Gao. But is it possible for Jesuit colleges and universities, and maybe we can ask Pat to address this first, Father Conroy, and then Congressman Gao, if you want to weigh in. But is it possible to engage with the political issues of the day without also being partisan? So how do we advance justice and some of the tensions that Congressman Gao raised, especially the racial tensions? How do we advance reconciliation without advancing? We can't do it without advancing justice. So how do we honor and navigate these tensions? Would you begin?
Well, where I'm going to begin, and I'm going to tie in the political because my examples would come from that. The thing about our Jesuit universities, Jesuit Higher Education, is that each of them, like each of our politicians, if you will, reside in and predominantly educate local or regional parts of the United States of America. And naturally so, and importantly so. I would say, it's my opinion from my observation, is that Georgetown may be the only truly national Jesuit university. It is certainly, in my opinion, the only international American Jesuit university. Boston College, Marquette, and Loyola Chicago, by virtue of being in the cities they're in, but also the size and integrity of their graduate departments, are also national drawers and international, but mostly on the graduate level. So when we're talking about educating and forming undergraduates, we are now coming to the rest, those four included, but the rest. And in the American West, from my time at Seattle U, and then talking and here at Gonzaga as well, there is a large interracial and international diversity, but it's uniquely Asian American, Asian national, or island cultures here in the U.S. So certainly international, but looking west instead of east, west, north, south. But at any rate, so what I observe here at Gonzaga, for example, is that Black Lives mattered. Here we're concerned about the legacy of whites moving into Native American homelands, and the discussion about whether or not Jesuits were part of the colonial enterprise, and are we carrying that on still, which would not, for example, be class material for BC. The thing is our region would call for a focus on that. Whereas Black Lives Matter, the Black community in Spokane is very, very small. So that to deal with that kind of polarization, it definitely is an academic exercise, which actually makes it more possible because you have fewer visceral actors involved in the classroom. But still, it's a local and regional audience. So the kinds of students who are there are more or less involved intellectually, if not personally. And then so to talk about how can Jesuit education deal with this, I do think that is to be addressed locally by the local academic community more than nationally.
Let's pause here to see if other people want to jump in, and what Pat is talking about, justice being enacted locally, in local context, and also, going from partisan and political to racism, and picking up on what Congressman Gao talked about, Black Lives Matter movement, and a person from the audience is asking, what is the role of division? Do we have to have division, discord, before we get to the heart of reconciliation? And Kathy, could you respond?
Yeah, I'm just going to go back to the rhetoric of frame in a way. When the cultural critic Matthew Arnold talked about the division between people who speak in the language of sweetness and light, and that would be eloquentia perfecta. That would be considering all options. And on the other side were the that was the Hellenic approach, was the Hebraic approach from the prophets, the language of fire and strength. And he said, the people who focus on fire and strength are always focused on the one thing needful. And I think political activists in the US system tend to focus on one thing. So the pro-life activists focus on abortion. You have to talk about abortion all the time. Activists in race, Black Lives Matter, they're focused on that. Environmental activists are focused on the environment. So you have a lot of activism and intensity of focus that comes along with being a political actor and a political agitator in the best sense of the word. How do those people broaden to encompass people who have more than one concern, and also people who may have questions about the tactics of the activist? I think the Catholic tradition and the Jesuit tradition have a couple of resources. One resource is, it may not have been fully successful, but the consistent ethic of life, right? You frame your issue in terms of a broader set of concerns about human dignity, and you take into account other people's concerns about human dignity and flourishing. So Black Lives Matter, it is an instantiation of all lives matter. It's not denying that, it's prioritizing something based on need. But you can look at the broader context and say, well, maybe everybody can be affirmed here, because the fundamental commitment is to the equality of all human beings. So that's one strategy, broadening the focus without and seeing consistency. And then the other thing that a lot of my grad students are working on is kind of community organizing, getting together with people who have different values, overlapping, sometimes similar, sometimes different, and advocating for something concrete and local. And then in the course of working together for a project, they get to see, well, I can see why so-and-so would have these concerns, even though they're not at the top of my own list of concerns. I can understand and empathize. If you work together doing something good with people, sometimes you can broaden your perspective. So those are two concrete strategies that I think that can honor the prophetic insight, but don't let it cut people off rather than broadening to bring people together.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Dr. Gannett and then Congressman Gao.
Yeah, I'd just like to offer two small things that sort of connect with that. And one is, I think that we need to teach all of our students to listen more deeply, because listening has to precede action and speech. And it is one of the things in the modern sort of discursive, immersive environment that we don't teach very well. And it goes back to things like reflection and meditation as well. But if we don't teach students to listen first, and we only teach them to speak first or to have a point of view, then it becomes very difficult for them to value that moment of stepping back, to maybe hear something they hadn't heard in something else, or to appreciate the right and speech of others, whether they agree or not, or whether they find it compelling or not. But that generosity of spirit is something I think we should inculcate across all of our classes and in every place in Jesuit universities. And the other thing I would just go back to along with this is and it goes along to what kinds of political speech or advocacy speech. I think that is important to nurture students to be able to speak up and take action in the public. But I think we also need to go back to what we call the rhetoric of the open hand and the rhetoric of the closed fist. And very, very much of what is now modeled for us in American public discourse is the rhetoric of the closed fists. So we need to actually have students learn to analyze that, step away from that as a model for public speaking, and at least have them engage in various kinds of rhetoric that are open, generous, and hospitable. Even as they learn their advocacy, it's really important to learn those other kinds of deep ways of knowing the other in order to move on any area.
Whoever thought that listening would be countercultural, but it is. Congressman Gao.
Yeah, I mean, in regards to question one, whether or not it's possible for Jesuit colleges and universities to engage with the vital political issues without also being partisan, I find that to be extremely difficult. And the reason is that many of our political society, our political society now is divided along ideological lines. And as a Catholic institution, for example, we have to be pro-life, and if you look at Congress right now, only one member of the Democratic Party is pro-life. So when you're talking about pro-life, it is difficult to not address the issue along ideological lines, because right now the rite of passage almost to be a member of Congress on the Democratic side is whether or not one is pro-life or not. And I was recently recruited by the Democratic pro-life movement to run for my old seat as a pro-life Democrat due to the fact that there's only one pro-life Democratic member. So when you're talking about certain issues, especially issues of abortion or other issues in connection with politics, it is extremely difficult to not be partisan without siding with one side or another, and that's the reality of it. I mean, we can be idealistic to discuss these issues objectively, but when you get down to the nitty-gritty of trying to push forward these issues, I find it extremely difficult not to be partisan. And then the other issue, or the other question that I have, is when we are advancing the general term justice, well, the problem is not promoting justice. The problem is understanding what justice is. Because if you talk to a conservative member of Congress, the notion of justice is very much different than a liberal member. When you're talking about, for example, social programs that would fund projects, when you're talking about a conservative member, well, the notion of justice for them is to spend the less money, the better. While on the liberal side, well, the more money we spend, the better. So there is a divide with the basic understanding of what justice is. So until we can come together to understand, or at least to reconcile the notion of what is just and what is not, I find it extremely difficult for Catholic universities, for any universities, to advance many of these issues without being partisan.
Well, let's see if we can engage in this dialogue without being partisan. Kathy?
Just have a question for the Congressman. I'm really grateful that you're here, because you are in the hot seat every day, and you have to face all the questions that we who are in academia can kind of put to the side. But what I wonder about Congress, and maybe this is just my own sense of things, and Father Pat can answer this too, is it's not so much that that there's not going to be different views on what counts as justice or what counts as the right thing to do, or the question about how you deal with the question of abortion in a pluralistic society. People do have different views on these matters. What strikes me, and this goes to the title of my book, which was Prophecy Without Contempt, is that now we Americans seem to think that somebody who doesn't have the same view that we have on a list of 6 issues is a contemptible person, that there's no way anyone could have a different view on abortion, on affirmative action, on pick the list of the 7 things that Pew is polling on, and without being guilty of a kind of moral or social turpitude. And I suppose the question I have for you, Congressman, is do you think that's a problem in Congress? Or do you think people understand, even can they say, I don't agree with you. I think you're wrong, but I understand how you got there. And, I don't wish you would, evaporate from the face of the earth because you don't think the same way that I do.
Again, it goes back to the polarization that we see at the political member within our own society, and it is extremely difficult to address many of these social issues without being partisan. Let me give you an example. As you know from my background, I was the only Republican member to vote for the House version of the Affordable Care Act. At that time in Congress, there were 6 other members in the Democratic side in the House that were pro-life, and they were basically destroyed by their own party because they held the line against the Affordable Care Act without certain pro-life language being incorporated onto the bill. So as our society becomes more and more polarized politically, the congressional members must become, or at least they must become, at least they have the image of becoming more polarized in order to satisfy their constituents. And one of my disappointments on the Hill is that the main focus of whether one is a Republican or one is a Democrat is how to get reelected. If you are on the minority side, it's how to get the majority. And then if you're on the majority side, it's how to keep the majority. And that's all we focus on as a political body, as a governmental institution, is how to get reelected. And to get reelected, one must please our own constituents. And it is until our mindset is somehow changed, until society comes to adopt a more objective understanding of what justice is, of what morality is, of what is good and what is bad, I find it extremely difficult not to be partisan.
So I wonder, in the absence of moving towards those commonly held definitions, where do we as Jesuit institutions move to promote reconciliation over winning? What role do we play? Anyone want to tackle that?
Again, the issue here is what are we trying to reconcile? When you're talking about when you're talking about the issue of pro-life versus pro-choice, I hate to go back to that, but that is at the center of at least the Catholic message, at least these days that I hear of. If we are a Catholic institution, how can we reconcile issues such as so difficult as being pro-life or being pro-choice? It's extremely difficult, and no matter how much I try to think it through, I myself cannot reconcile it, unless other people might have a more objective understanding of what this issue is all about. It's hard for me to see a Catholic institution trying to reconcile these issues when at least the message from the Vatican is that we cannot.
So
I'd like to weigh in.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I think that the pro-life, pro-choice debate, as it's been laid out, is a false dichotomy, a false disagreement. The bishops have historically framed it this way. If a pro-life as being defined, as I presume it's being defined as you have to be on the side of making abortion illegal, then that's the only pro-life position. And if to be that, you have to be a Republican, where's the rest of Catholic social teaching, which the Vatican has also said that's pro-life as well? And the so-called non-pro-life Democrats are the ones who push the Catholic social teaching pro-life agenda. So the thing is this: in Catholic social teaching, the human conscience reigns supreme. Are we going to say in the United States of America that we can demand that women form their conscience the way we want them to? In the United States of America, we can't do that. So how do we form young men and women who are Catholics to understand the other issues that go into why a woman might choose abortion even though she doesn't want to, so that we convince Americans to value the free choice of every American to make the choice we might want them to make? And so where do we put our money? There's the political argument. It's not in putting a legal end to abortion, it's making it irrelevant by empowering women to choose life.
Thank you, Pat, for taking our perspective back to the broader issues. Kathy?
Just intervening on the same thing. I think Father Pat was looking at one way of doing it, which is some people define, pro-life very narrowly, and he's calling for a broader definition of pro-life in a more consistent ethic of life manner. Another way is to say, well, the idea is to focus not so much on the supply side of abortion, but also on the demand side of abortion, why women are seeking abortion, and let's work in our society on that. The third thing I would say, and maybe this is, I'm having a crisis of vocation here, I suppose. So I wrote a book called Law's Virtues, which drew on a Thomistic philosophy of law and how it would approach complicated questions about what do you do when, you've got an idea of what the law should be, but the society doesn't go along with it. And Aquinas has got very complicated ways of looking at, how far the law can go in a context where the rest, the population doesn't accept it. It isn't simply you take the moral law and you replicate it in the positive law. A law has to be in accordance with the custom of the country, according to Aquinas. Now, you're not going to get anybody on, on the National Right to Life Committee or Planned Parenthood to start reading, my book or Aquinas. But I do think that what Catholic schools can do and what Jesuit schools have to do is to say, hey, these questions are complicated. We've got the moral question, and then you have the question of how the law should operate in a pluralistic society, given the limits about what law can ever do. We may be, spitting into the wind, Fox News and MSNBC. But our job, I think, as teachers, and this is where you can see both sides, I think, is to show the complexities of issues, relating to law and policy, and to train our students to at least see how somebody could get to a different perspective. Now, whether we've been doing a good job at that, I don't know. And, maybe it was a quixotic endeavor, but that's what I feel my job is as a professor at a Catholic institution, is to show people that the tradition is not reducible to a soundbite.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to start with you, Cynthia. But we're going to do a go around. And if everyone can take a minute to think about what you want to offer, given this wide ranging discussion that's so charged. You can see all the ways that we get caught, right? And in our society, as institutions, what we have to grapple with at different levels. What do you want to leave our audience with as we grapple with these issues?
Yeah.
Dr. Gannett.
Yeah, I was trying to think about that, and there are too many things to say, so I'll just choose one or two, but maybe they might be part of this. I want to remind us that the Jesuits were born at a time of great cultural and confessional turbulence and violence, not unlike the present. And so the Jesuits saw the great need to be persuasive to many people who did not agree with them, to people of many different views, backgrounds, ideologies, religious confessions, races, cultures. And so they built these tools, accommodation, rhetorical accommodation, notions of accompaniment, notions of dialogue, notions of listening, in order to do that difficult, messy work of bringing people together, not necessarily to make them all the same, but to reconcile differences sufficiently so that people could flourish. And that's what I still think that we want to try to do, and we should do better and more at Jesuit institutions, and do it more thoroughly, and do it everywhere, and do it explicitly. So because the Jesuits wanted people to be persuasive, they, as opposed to sort of basically just having another 100 years war, which they had enough of, they really felt that mostly you could use words rather than weapons. Now, we know you can weaponize words too, but I think that we really have to give our students this gift of the powerful and transformative possibilities of language, so that they don't get caught in something as simple and silly as pro-life or pro-choice, which again, I would argue are false terms, no matter what your ideological apparatus might be. I'd like to remind us that the Jesuits saw in Cicero, whom they sometimes called Saint Cicero, a deep connection with their own sense of ministry and mastery of the word. And here's Cicero speaking: "We are not born for ourselves alone. We as human beings are born for the sake of other human beings, that we might be able mutually to help one another." If all of our students were fully immersed in those kinds of ideas throughout all 4 years or 6 years, or if they're BC Triple Eagles, even more years of Jesuit education, they might create a different polity when they all get to Congress. They might learn how to talk to each other maybe a little differently. I'd like to just also end with Eric Dockstetter in terms of reconciliation itself. He wrote this amazing work called "With Faith in the Works of Words, the Beginning of Reconciliation in South Africa." And he described what he called intimate public language for reconciliation truth. Talk about difficult and hard. The reconciliation talks in South Africa were very and continue to be very hard. And he said, making engaged opponents out of sworn enemies, reconciliation's fragile words come to constitute the potential for politics, and the politics of potential. I think, as he says, and this is his final sentence, in the domain of art far more than science, reconciliation appears to begin with the words that hold the seemingly miraculous capacity to form and fashion human relationships. And that is the capacity that I think we can continue to nurture and develop at Jesuit schools.
Thank you, Dr. Gannett. I'm going to ask Father Pat to go next.
I just want to, when we talk about how are we able at a university to raise up the issues or the conversation about reconciliation without politicizing that, ultimately it calls for every one of us to have a personal conversion to peace and reconciliation. Yeah. Our students, our world, our country, our regional communities do not need more division, more polarization coming out of the mouths of our professors, right, or out of our university. We need to be healed and bring healing and reconciliation. And that's what I would encourage of all of us, that if we ourselves are polarized within, that we ask for that healing, that we might, through our institutions, bring hope and reconciliation.
Thank you. Congressman Gao.
Yes. Again, I'm very honored to be part of this panel to discuss what are we as we move forward as Catholic, as Jesuit institutions, in order to provide or at least form our students to be more social conscious of what we have to deal with in community, in society, and how to make the right choices. And I find it extremely difficult because I myself, I have 3 children, 2 daughters and a young son. And I worry every day what kind of choices they are to make. And the only thing that I as a parent and we as an institution can do is provide them with the tools to analyze the problem, to analyze the situation, and then to arrive at hopefully the right choice. And that is what I hope that we can do as a Catholic institution, to provide our students with the necessary tools for them to analyze problems objectively and to analyze them correctly, and to hopefully lead them to making the right decisions.
Thank you. And Kathy?
Thank you so much for a wonderful panel discussion, much to think about. I just want to make, I think, 3 points, Jesuit, in good Jesuit form. First, the word reconcile means back and conciliar, together, to bring together. So reconciliation is a way of bringing people together. Second, I think bringing people together requires not only good argument and good words, but also imagination and empathy. If we're bringing somebody together, we have to be able to figure out and imagine ourselves in their shoes and where they're coming from. So we need to supplement rhetoric with literature, with stories, with listening to people's broader experience. And the third point, I guess the question I would like to ask my students and ask everybody listening this to consider as a form of discernment is, have you ever changed your mind about anything? And if so, what made you change your mind? Was it an argument? Was it an indictment? Or was it a kind of experience of insight that came from seeing something from somebody else's perspective? And if that's the case, then we should think about changing one another's minds in a way that actually works and that isn't simply a question of throwing word missiles at them. Those are my 3 points.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists. This has been very stirring and reminds us that there's everything at stake to learn this work, to engage in these practices, to be able to connect with each other, to dialogue, to not throw the word missiles only, but to figure out how to move forward together. So on behalf of Conversations on Jesuit Higher Education, especially the chair of the seminar, Father Jim McMartin, AJCU, especially BP for Communications, Deanna Howes-Spiro. I want to thank all our panelists and audience members for joining us for this session. And we have much to ponder here, personally within ourselves and communally as institutions. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you all. Good, and go Zags.
Bye.
Wait a minute. Thank you.